A woman dies in a hotel room. A jury is asked to decide whether what happened was a crime or something else. The case hinges on how consent is defined, how injury is interpreted, and how a victim is described in open court. In 2011, Cindy Gladue was killed in Edmonton. What followed was not a single verdict, but years of legal disagreement about responsibility. Tonight, we're examining that case, and what it reveals about the limits of justice when the system itself becomes part of the story. On a summer night in June 2011, a hotel room in downtown Edmonton became the starting point of a case that would move through Canada's justice system for more than a decade. Cindy Gladue was 36 years old and a member of the Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation. Court records establish only a small amount about Cindy's life outside the events in that hotel room: her age, her identity, and where she was from. Much of what the jury would later hear about her came through the narrow lens of the encounter itself. That night, she arranged to meet a man she had been communicating with earlier. His name was Bradley Barton. Barton was a long-haul truck driver from Mississauga, Ontario, in Edmonton for work. Court records show that Barton checked into the hotel room earlier that evening and waited there alone. Cindy arrived later. According to evidence accepted by the courts, the two had not met before. They connected through an online escort ad and agreed to meet for a paid sexual encounter. No one else was present in the room while they were together. What happened inside that room was later examined through medical, forensic, and police evidence, not eyewitness accounts. At some point during the encounter, Cindy suffered a catastrophic internal injury. Medical testimony established that the injury caused massive internal bleeding. This evidence was not disputed. The medical examiner ruled her death a homicide. Toxicology results showed alcohol in her system, but it was not identified as a contributing cause of death. After Cindy became unresponsive, Barton contacted emergency services. Police and paramedics arrived at the hotel. Cindy was pronounced dead at the scene. Barton was taken into custody and later charged with second-degree murder. From the outset, investigators were working with a confined evidentiary window. There were no independent witnesses to what occurred inside the room. The timeline depended on hotel records, Barton's account, and forensic findings. With no third party present and no dispute about who caused the injury, the investigation quickly narrowed to how, not by whom, Cindy died. That narrowing would shape the case. From its earliest stages, the question was less about identifying a suspect and more about determining how the law should interpret a fatal injury that occurred during a private encounter. In the days that followed, several facts remained uncontested. Cindy was alive when she entered the hotel room. She died from a traumatic injury inflicted while she was alone with Barton. Barton was the person who caused that injury. What remained unclear, and what would ultimately define the case, was how Canadian law should interpret what occurred in that room. The prosecution argued that the injury amounted to criminal violence and that consent could not apply to harm of that magnitude. The defense argued that the injury occurred during consensual sexual activity, and that the law, as it stood at the time, did not criminalize what happened. That distinction became the central question before the court, not whether Cindy was injured, not whether the injury was fatal, but whether the law recognized what happened as a crime. Everything that followed, the acquittal, the appeals, and the later conviction, would turn on how that question was answered. By the time the case reached trial in 2015, the physical facts were settled. Cindy was dead. The injury that killed her was severe and uncontested, and it occurred while she was alone with Barton. The trial was not about whether an injury occurred. It was about how the law should understand that injury. The Crown's case focused on the limits of consent under Canadian criminal law. Prosecutors argued that the magnitude of the harm placed it outside what a person can legally consent to, regardless of the context in which the encounter began. From the Crown's perspective, the severity of the injury itself demonstrated criminal violence. The defense took a narrower legal path. Defense counsel argued that Cindy had agreed to a paid sexual encounter and that the injury occurred during activity to which she consented. The defense emphasized that there was no proof Barton intended to cause serious bodily harm, and that the Crown had not established, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the injury fell outside the scope of consent, as the law was then interpreted. To resolve that dispute, the court examined not only medical evidence, but language. Trial transcripts show that Cindy was repeatedly framed through the context of the transaction. Arguments emphasized her agreement to meet for sex and treated that agreement as a lens through which consent was assessed. The focus shifted away from her as a victim of fatal harm and toward what risks in the defense's framing were implicitly accepted. This framing mattered. In criminal law, consent is not assessed in the abstract. It is assessed through the facts and the way those facts are presented. In this case, appellate courts would later observe that the language used at trial risked collapsing consent to sexual activity into consent to serious bodily injury. One of the most controversial moments of the trial occurred during the presentation of physical evidence. The court permitted the Crown to introduce preserved tissue from Cindy's body as an exhibit. The handling and discussion of that evidence became central to later appellate review. While the exhibit was admitted at trial, appellate judges would later question whether its presentation respected the dignity of the deceased and whether it was necessary to prove the Crown's case. At the conclusion of the trial, the judge accepted the defense's position on consent. In written reasons, the judge found that the Crown had not proven Barton intended to cause serious bodily harm, nor that he knew serious bodily harm was likely to occur. The judge concluded that the Crown failed to establish that the injury fell outside the scope of consent as applied in law at the time. On that basis, Barton was acquitted of murder. The verdict rested on legal reasoning, not factual dispute. The judge did not question that Cindy had died from a severe injury inflicted by Barton. The acquittal turned entirely on how the law interpreted consent, intent, and bodily harm. The reaction was immediate. Indigenous leaders, legal scholars, and advocacy organizations raised concerns about how Cindy had been characterized in court, how consent had been applied, and whether the proceedings had treated her as a full legal subject. Public statements and commentary focused on the broader implications of the ruling, what it suggested about whose bodies are protected by law and whose harm is minimized through legal framing. Those concerns did not remain in public discourse alone. They formed the basis of a formal appeal. The case was taken to the Alberta Court of Appeal, where judges were tasked with a different question. They were not asked whether the verdict felt just. They were asked whether the trial had been conducted according to law and whether the legal principles governing consent and evidence had been correctly applied. Their review would extend beyond the outcome and into the structure of the trial itself, the reasoning, the evidentiary rulings, and the assumptions embedded in the court's approach. From there, the case would move one step further, to the Supreme Court of Canada. What those courts would say next would not simply revisit the verdict. It would redefine how consent and serious bodily harm are understood in Canadian criminal law, and reopen a case many believed had already been decided. The appeal that followed the 2015 acquittal did not ask the courts to reweigh the evidence or to decide whether the verdict felt right. It asked a narrower legal question, whether the trial judge had applied the law correctly. The case first went to the Alberta Court of Appeal. Appellate judges reviewed the trial record line by line, the legal framework used to assess consent, the evidentiary rulings, and the reasoning that led to acquittal. In its decision, the Court of Appeal found that the trial judge had made legal errors in how consent was analyzed. The appellate court held that the judge failed to properly consider the limits of consent under Canadian criminal law, particularly in cases involving serious bodily harm. The court concluded that consent to sexual activity does not automatically extend to conduct that causes grave injury, and that the trial decision had collapsed those concepts into one. The appellate court also addressed how evidence had been treated at trial. Judges raised concerns about the analytical framework used to assess whether the harm fell outside lawful consent, and whether the trial judge had given sufficient weight to the severity of the injury itself when determining criminal liability. On that basis, the Alberta Court of Appeal set aside the acquittal and ordered a new trial. That decision did not end the matter. Barton appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, asking the country's highest court to reinstate the acquittal. In 2019, the Supreme Court released its decision. The court upheld the order for a new trial. In its reasons, the Supreme Court clarified how consent must be understood in Canadian criminal law. The court emphasized that while adults may consent to certain risks inherent in sexual activity, Consent does not extend to conduct that causes serious bodily harm. The court held that the trial judge had erred by failing to properly apply that legal boundary. The Supreme Court also addressed the broader implications of the trial's reasoning. Without retrying the facts, the court made clear that legal analysis cannot ignore the extent of injury when assessing consent. Where harm is severe, the law requires a careful and explicit analysis of whether consent can legally exist at all. Importantly, the Supreme Court did not declare Barton guilty. It did not substitute its own verdict. Instead, it confirmed that the legal framework applied at trial was flawed, and that the case had to be heard again under the correct legal principles. The ruling sent the case back for a new trial. By this point, the case had already reshaped legal discussion across Canada. Courts, scholars, and prosecutors now had clearer guidance on how consent and serious bodily harm must be analyzed together, not separately. The decision reinforced that consent is not a blanket defense and that its limits are defined by law, not by context alone. For Cindy's family, the Supreme Court's decision meant that the legal process was not over. For the justice system, it marked a turning point, a correction of how the law had been applied, and a signal that the earlier handling of the case could not stand. The new trial would not revisit the night at the Edmonton hotel. Those facts were already established. It would revisit the law. The new trial took place under a different legal framework than the one applied in 2015. By the time the case returned to court, appellate rulings had clarified a key principle. While adults may consent to sexual activity, Canadian criminal law does not recognize consent to actions that causes serious bodily harm. That clarification reshaped how the evidence would be assessed. The retrial did not reopen the physical facts. Cindy had died from a severe injury. Barton had caused that injury. Those points were not contested. What changed was how the court was required to interpret responsibility. At the conclusion of the retrial, Barton was convicted of manslaughter. The conviction reflected the court's finding that, while the Crown had not proven intent to kill or intent to cause grievous bodily harm at the level required for murder, the conduct that caused Cindy's death met the legal threshold for criminal liability. In Canadian law, manslaughter occupies a specific space. It recognizes that a death resulted from unlawful conduct, even where intent to kill is not established. The conviction confirmed that the fatal injury could not be legally justified through consent. During sentencing, the court considered both aggravating and mitigating factors as required by law. The severity of the injury and the loss of life were central. At the same time, the court assessed intent, the circumstances of the offense, and Barton's personal background. Barton was sentenced to a term of imprisonment. The sentence reflected the court's obligation to balance denunciation, deterrence, and proportionality, principles that guide sentencing across Canadian criminal law. The conviction marked a definitive legal outcome, but it did not resolve all questions surrounding the case. For Cindy's family and many Indigenous advocates, the manslaughter verdict was seen as a form of accountability, but not necessarily closure. Public statements following the sentencing reflected a recognition that the legal process had corrected earlier errors, while also acknowledging that the harm extended beyond what any sentence could address. From an institutional perspective, the conviction underscored the impact of appellate oversight. The outcome was not the result of new evidence, but of corrected legal interpretation. The same facts, examined under a different legal framework, produced a different result. The case also left a broader imprint on Canadian jurisprudence. Courts now had clearer direction on how to assess consent in cases involving serious injury. Prosecutors had firmer guidance on how to frame such cases, and trial judges were reminded that consent must be evaluated within strict legal boundaries, not inferred from context alone. The manslaughter conviction closed the courtroom phase of the case. It confirmed that consent could not legally excuse the harm that caused Cindy's death. From the night Cindy died to the final conviction, nearly a decade passed. The evidence did not change during that time. The law's interpretation did. By the time the legal process concluded, the Cindy Gladue case had become more than a single prosecution. It had become a reference point for how Canadian courts understand consent, bodily harm, and the treatment of Indigenous victims within the justice system. The Cindy Gladue case did not change the criminal code. It clarified how existing law must be applied when consent and serious bodily harm intersect. One of the clearest outcomes was doctrinal. Decisions by the Supreme Court of Canada confirmed that while adults may consent to sexual activity, consent does not extend to conduct that causes serious bodily harm. That clarification now guides how trial courts assess similar cases across the country. The facts never changed. The interpretation did. The case also exposed how courtroom framing affects legal outcomes. Appellate courts emphasize that legal analysis cannot be detached from the severity of harm. Where injury is grave, courts are required to scrutinize whether consent can exist at all, rather than assuming it from context. This was not a change in facts, but a correction in method. Beyond doctrine, the case drew attention to how victims are characterized in court. Judicial commentary and subsequent legal analysis noted that the way Cindy was presented during the original trial risked narrowing her identity to circumstance, rather than recognizing her as a rights-bearing individual. That concern was grounded in the record and informed appellate scrutiny of the trial process. These observations aligned with broader findings already documented in national reviews. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls identified patterns in which Indigenous women are less likely to be afforded full credibility and dignity within institutional systems, including policing and the courts. While Cindy's case was not part of the inquiry's mandate, its trajectory echoed concerns already on the public record. The case also highlighted the corrective role of appellate oversight. The eventual conviction did not come from new evidence. It came from correcting legal error. Higher courts required that existing evidence be assessed under the proper legal framework, reinforcing the principle that trial outcomes are not final when the law itself has been misapplied. At the same time, official records are clear about what the case did not do. It did not create new offenses. It did not rewrite the criminal code. It did not resolve broader inequities in the justice system. What it did was narrow, but significant. It corrected how consent and serious bodily harm are legally understood, and it signaled that courtroom practices must respect the dignity of those whose lives are under examination. In that sense, Cindy's case illustrates both the strengths and the limits of the justice system. It shows how legal error can persist at trial, how appellate courts can intervene, and how long that process can take. It also shows that legal correction, while necessary, often arrives years after the harm has already occurred. The record does not support sweeping conclusions, but it does support this one. Outcomes in the justice system are shaped not only by facts, but by how law is applied, how evidence is framed, and how people are recognized within the courtroom. That is the legacy this case leaves in the official record. This case did not hinge on unanswered questions. It hinged on how the law defined responsibility. The facts never changed. The interpretation did. Cindy Gladue's death moved through the justice system for years, not because evidence was missing, but because the limits of consent were misapplied. The final outcome corrected that error, but it also revealed how long correction can take, and who bears the cost while it happens. Thanks for staying with us. If you're listening all the way through, welcome back.
Thanks for being here. We wanted to take a few minutes to talk about why this case matters beyond the verdict itself.
The Cindy Gladue case is difficult, not because the facts are unclear, but because the outcome depended entirely on how the law was applied. The same evidence led to two very different legal conclusions, years apart.
And that gap matters, not just legally, but socially. This case forced courts to confront how consent is defined, how injury is assessed, and how a victim is framed inside a courtroom.
It also matters who the victim was. Cindy was an Indigenous woman. That context doesn't explain the outcome on its own, but it does shape how the case was experienced by her family and by Indigenous communities across the country.
Especially when you look at how little of Cindy's life appeared in the trial record. The focus narrowed quickly to circumstance and transaction, rather than personhood. That absence is part of what so many people reacted to.
It's worth noting that this isn't the first time we've examined how violence against sex workers intersects with the justice system. In episode 23, we covered the murder of Brenda Way in Nova Scotia.
That case showed a failure at the investigative level. Missed warnings, delayed responses, and how a vulnerable woman wasn't protected before she was killed.
What makes Cindy's case different is where the failure occurred. Here, the breakdown wasn't in identifying a suspect or collecting evidence.
It happened inside the courtroom, in how consent was interpreted and how the victim was framed under the law.
2 cases, 2 provinces, 2 different points of failure, but the same underlying question about whose harm is fully recognized by the system.
And that's why this episode stayed so tightly focused on court records. Not to strip emotion away, but to be honest about how decisions were made and how long it took for those decisions to be corrected. If you value careful, evidence-based storytelling like this, you can support the show by subscribing, sharing the episode, or leaving a rating or review. It helps the channel grow and makes space for more episodes like this.
Thank you for joining us once again.
Thanks for listening.
See you next Monday. Until then, take care of each other.